What's up, people? I'm going to talk about session prep today because a common claim I've seen in a lot of dungeon tubers and kind of the space in general is that it seems to be the best advice that a lot of these channels give is you only really prep 1 to maybe 2 sessions ahead, but often the headline advice is prepping 1 session ahead only, because you don't know what the player is going to do, etc. And I think that's just not true and kind of not bad advice, but misleading advice possibly for some newer dungeon masters or game masters who may be playing the game. And the reason I think this is because I feel like there's a lot of scenarios where you're really prepping very far ahead. I mean, 8, 10, 12, 20 sessions ahead, several months of play ahead. And I don't know if it's just not being considered prep, so it's not in the verbiage, or if that part is sort of considered maybe campaign prep, so it's not part of it. But kind of the first sub point I want to deconstruct here is I think that this claim needs 4 asterisks after it, because if you look at firstly when this claim is made, it's not really clarified whether this is for a linear or a sandbox style campaign, because this can be possible in a more linear campaign where players are really going from A to B, or maybe from A they can go to B or C and branch a little bit, but you're only really going in 1 or 2 directions towards this, end goal or big bad that the campaign has. But I feel like for sandbox campaigns, the 1 session prep is kind of very hard to do, because in order to set up the world and know what's going on and have a living world and multiple factions, you have to plan far ahead. You have to understand what the faction goals are, what they're doing in the background. You have to understand how the world is changing around the players, and if they take this action, then that's going to have ramifications later because, they decided to not save the prince, so now this faction, doesn't have an heir or something like that, if it's kind of like a kingdom-style sandbox. And that's not a session ahead. It's just flat out not. There's no part of that is a single session away. That is, 5, 6, 10 sessions ahead of time. And 1 session prep just does not cut that. You can't have this living, breathing world that has all of these payoffs later on without doing a lot of future setup. And another kind of point to this, and really in general, I mean, we all understand that linear campaigns versus sandbox campaigns, sandbox usually just takes more. You need more options for the players, you need to be able to pivot on more directions for them to go, while your typical linear campaign, there is a big bad or an obvious objective at the end of it, and maybe there's some side missions on the way, but most of the time you can kind of know where your players are going, maybe 9 out of 10 times if you've been playing with the group for a while. People aren't that hard to predict, especially when you present them. If I present you 2 pieces of evidence and that's all you have to go on, and an NPC has a little bit more that also pushes a certain direction, I mean, 90% of the time the players are going to go that direction. There's that other, 1 out of 10 chance that they squirrel off and do something random, but that's not the rule. That's not super common. At least from my table and from what I've seen of others, it's pretty easy to, in a linear campaign, plot things out for the player. Now, for a sandbox campaign, that's definitely not the case. If you're running a true sandbox where there's a bunch of quest hooks and random side missions, and then those side missions might lead into full-scale missions, you can't really guess as much, and you can't really just prep a single session ahead. Like I was saying before, if there's multiple factions and you have to know how all of these factions are interacting, you kind of need almost not the brass tacks of a session planned out, but at least the framework of how these factions are going to work out later on. And I really just disagree with the concept of like, oh, I only flesh out a session ahead, because there's so much work that goes into setting up these factions and having interesting things happen in the background if you're running the kind of game that like doesn't have, everyone just waiting around as a static Skyrim NPC talking about arrows hitting their knees. You actually have moving factions with armies and, nobles and whatnot who are making decisions. And that just takes multiple sessions of prep. You're planning for the players to encounter something. If I'm in this part of the world and in 6 sessions, a war is going to have a huge battle on the other side, and that's going to have ramifications throughout the sandbox, that's not a session ahead. That's 6 sessions ahead with ramifications you have to plan out ahead of time. Now, I mean, you could argue that, like, maybe the concrete details of everything aren't exactly set in stone until you're exactly there. But if you're kind of dropping hints of things happening, and this will kind of tie into the next thing, dropping hints and dropping rumors so that the next thing that's happening in the world is telegraphed, takes, prepping, that far ahead. The war that's going to happen in the sandbox between the northern and southern kingdoms that's going to have ramifications in the east, you can prep that a session ahead, or you can drop rumors and hints and have like recruiting campaigns and mercenaries getting hired, a bunch of the stuff 6-7 sessions before the actual battle happened to telegraph the current political landscape and show the players like, hey, this is about to happen. If you want to be part of it, like, head west and see what's going on. And that point really ties in to my next one for like dropping hints and rumors, is I feel like for investigative games, this is also just kind of bad advice. I don't know how you would run a long-term investigative campaign in certain systems without prepping pretty far ahead, like 4 or 5 sessions, so that way the clues make sense. And a side point here, I feel like a lot of the YouTubers I see spam this advice and say, oh, I only prep a session ahead, also typically pull from modules that they just openly say that they like extract little snippets from third-party modules or old official modules and just plop it in their game. And it's like, well, yeah, you only prep a session ahead, but you also just took an entire pre-built 4 to 5 session adventure and plopped it in. So like someone else prepped 4 or 5 sessions ahead. It wasn't you, so technically you're not like lying or anything, but somebody did at some point in time if you're just going to take a module and use it. But back to the main point, for investigative games, I mean, you have to be able to set up clues in like a satisfying domino to an endpoint and drop, foreshadowing or hints of those clues earlier. Like we're looking at systems like Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green. Those take a lot of session prep ahead of time, like the adventure book. I think there's like a Keen and Yellow adventure book for Delta Green. I don't know the exact name of Delta Green's campaign books, but it takes you through this huge investigatory thing that has a ton of tie-ins from like early sessions to the later ones, so that stuff that happens early on in the campaign makes sense later, and all of this. You cannot do that with one session prep. You have to prep 10 to 12 sessions ahead of time at least to have a satisfying payoff of like, oh yeah, remember that strange statue you found in the corner of the tavern that was kind of painted gold and it looked like an occult statue? Well, now, 14 sessions later, a few months in real world of actually playing the game, you find the cult and their main symbol is this, and that makes sense because now that means that the barkeep was in on the cult, and that's why he knew this certain information, which made this other conversation make sense because he wouldn't have known that unless he was part of the cult, and da-da-da-da-da. You have to you have to be ahead of the game in order to do that. And there's no way a one session prep is going to be able to accomplish massive payoffs like that. And, you know, at the end of the day, that's really all I have to say about session prep, and why I kind of think that it's bogus to a certain extent is if you're setting up long-term payoffs, even BBGs and whatnot, like that's not really one session ahead. That's like you have a framework, so you have a prep of about 12 sessions, and you maybe concrete in some details 1 or 2 sessions ahead of time, but you still laid all the groundwork. It's just no one says that. No one explains how to lay that groundwork. The video is usually, this is how you're, the best low prep DM possible. And then they skip the whole part of how they like set up a campaign, and that took like 4 or 5 hours to do all of the late term payoffs, and they just like leave that out. Or maybe they're just not doing it at all. That's also possible. I don't know. I'm not playing in these people's games. But at the end of the day, there is also sort of like a group type that I guess this matters to, because if you are playing with sort of like random people at a shop or something, there's probably not a whole lot of a point in trying to do these long-term payoffs in your games if you're not super confident in them actually getting there. But for people who have been playing with a group for a while and at least have like a steady flow of players, or just a steady group of players they've played with for years, one session prep, I just feel like it's kind of a, what would the word be, a misnomer by some degree. It's kind of just like a flashy thing to say, like how to lower your prep time. It's like a catch line, but frankly, I just think it's kind of BS. But that's just my thoughts. What are yours? Thanks for watching. See you later.